The Strait of Hormuz does not give warnings. It gives incidents, and the difference between an incident and a war is measured in the decisions made in the 90 seconds after the radar picture changes. At 6:17 a.m., the radar picture changed. A United States Navy MQ-4C Triton unmanned maritime surveillance aircraft had been on station over the central Strait of Hormuz for 4 hours and 51 minutes, holding a racetrack orbit at 52,000 feet in international airspace above the waterway's navigable channel. The Triton's mission was routine in the operational sense: persistent maritime domain awareness over the Strait's shipping traffic, monitoring vessel movements and electronic emissions in a corridor that carries roughly 20% of the world's seaborne crude petroleum through a gap that narrows to under 22 nautical miles at its tightest point. The aircraft was not conducting a provocative maneuver. It was not approaching the Iranian coastline. It was not deviating from a track that had been flown by American surveillance platforms in this airspace on over 300 previous occasions without incident. At 6:17 a.m., the Triton's radar warning receivers registered a surface-to-air missile guidance radar emission from the Iranian coastline on a bearing of 341. The emission was in a frequency band associated with the long-range surface-to-air missile systems that Iran had been fielding and refining for the previous decade. Systems with engagement ceilings that the operational planning community had assessed, with reasonable confidence, as not reliably reaching 52,000 feet against a low observable, high-altitude target in the Triton's radar cross-section category. Reasonable confidence, not certainty. The distinction between those two assessments existed in the planning documents and had never been operationally tested against this specific system variant at this specific altitude and range combination. It was tested at 6:17 a.m. The missile launch was detected by the Defense Support Program satellite constellation at 6:17 a.m. and 14 seconds. A thermal bloom from the Iranian coastline, climbing steeply northeast on a ballistic trajectory that the processing algorithm characterized in the first 4 seconds of track as consistent with a long-range surface-to-air missile in boost phase. The automated alert was transmitted to the Combined Air Operations Center and to the Triton's ground control station simultaneously. The Triton's onboard systems activated their evasive response protocol at 6:17 a.m. and 19 seconds, 5 seconds after the launch detection. The protocol commanded the aircraft to execute a hard descending turn to the southeast while dispensing chaff and activating its electronic countermeasures suite. At 52,000 feet, a hard descending turn is not the instantaneous maneuver that the phrase implies. The Triton is an aircraft optimized for persistence and sensor payload, not for the kind of rapid, high-G maneuvering that would characterize a fighter jet's defensive response to an inbound missile. Its maximum sustained bank angle at cruise altitude is constrained by its wing loading and its structural limits, and those constraints were absolute regardless of the urgency of what was climbing toward it from the Iranian coast. The missile reached 52,000 feet at 6:18 a.m. and 44 seconds. The intercept point was 3.1 nautical miles inside the internationally recognized boundary of international airspace, above a portion of the strait that Iran had previously claimed as part of its territorial airspace in a formal declaration that the United States and the majority of the international community had not recognized and had explicitly rejected through diplomatic channels, through formal legal submissions to the International Civil Aviation Organization, and through 3 years of continued flight operations in the disputed zone that were specifically designed to demonstrate non-acceptance of the Iranian claim. The Triton's radar return disappeared from every tracking system at 6:18 a.m. and 44 seconds. In the ground control station in Bahrain, the primary pilot, the remote operator who had been controlling the Triton's flight path for the past 3 hours and 22 minutes, lost data link contact at 6:18 a.m. and 44 seconds simultaneously with the radar return disappearance. The loss was clean and total, not the gradual degradation that characterized a communications failure or a navigation system fault, but the instantaneous absence that characterized structural airframe loss. He reported it to the mission supervisor in 9 seconds, in the flat, factual language that professionals use when the facts are bad enough to speak for themselves. Mission Supervisor, Primary Pilot. Loss of all data link and telemetry on Triton at 6:18 and 44 seconds. Assess asset loss. Last confirmed position 52,000 feet, international airspace, Strait of Hormuz Central Channel. The Combined Air Operations Center received the asset loss report at 6:19 a.m. The duty officer had been tracking the missile launch from the moment the satellite alert arrived and had already initiated the theater alert protocol before the Triton loss was formally confirmed. The protocol activated 3 simultaneous reporting chains to Pacific Command, to CENTCOM, and to the National Military Command Center, and generated the automatic tasking for the combat air patrol assets that were the most immediate military response available in the theater. 2 FA-18E Super Hornets assigned to the Northern Gulf Combat Air Patrol were at 24,000 feet, 67 nautical miles south of the Strait's Central Channel. At the moment, the Triton was engaged. They received the scramble vector at 6:19 a.m. and 30 seconds and pushed their throttles to full military power immediately, climbing and accelerating toward the northern bearing. The flight time from their current position to the engagement area at maximum continuous power was approximately 7 minutes. 7 minutes in which the Iranian air defense system that had just demonstrated a capability the American operational planning community had assessed as marginal was still operational, still potentially targeted, and, if it had missiles remaining, still capable of engaging additional assets in the airspace above the strait. The flight lead was a pilot with 12 years in the FA-18 community who had been briefed on the Iranian surface-to-air missile threat in every pre-deployment intelligence package for the past 4 deployments, and who had developed, over those 4 deployments, a specific and professionally calibrated understanding of the gap between assessed capability and demonstrated capability. The assessment had said the Iranian system's engagement ceiling against a target in the Triton's category was marginal at 52,000 feet. The Triton was gone. The assessment and the demonstrated reality had diverged, and the divergence had cost the United States Navy a $220 million surveillance platform and whatever data it had been collecting in the moments before 6:18 a.m. He climbed through 31,000 feet at 6:21 a.m. and checked his weapons configuration. 2 AIM-120 AMR AAMS, 2 AIM-9X Sidewinders, 1 AGM-88 HARM anti-radiation missile on the port wing station. The HARM had been loaded as a precautionary measure for the Northern Gulf CAP given the elevated threat assessment that had been briefed at the pre-mission intelligence update 18 hours earlier. It was a weapon designed for one specific purpose: to home on the electromagnetic emissions of an active radar system and destroy the antenna and electronics that were producing them. A surface-to-air missile battery that was actively tracking aircraft was, by the physics of how the HARM's seeker head worked, providing its own targeting solution to any HARM-equipped aircraft within its engagement range. The Iranian SAM battery's fire control radar had been continuously active since the missile launch at 6:17 a.m. It was still transmitting at 6:21 a.m. The Rivet joint aircraft that had been repositioned to a collection orbit north of the Triton's last position was recording every millisecond of it. At 6:22 a.m., the CAOC transmitted the rules of engagement update to the flight lead's aircraft via encrypted data link. The update was classified and specific. It authorized the employment of suppression of enemy air defense assets, SEAD, against the radar system that had engaged the Triton, contingent on confirmation that the system was actively tracking U.S. military aircraft. The authorization was conditioned, not blanket. It required a specific trigger: active radar track of a U.S. military asset by the Iranian system. An Iranian radar that was transmitting but not actively tracking a U.S. military aircraft was not, under the rules of engagement update, an authorized target. An Iranian radar that was actively tracking a U.S. military aircraft was. The distinction required measurement. The measurement required the flight lead to fly close enough to the Iranian radar's position to determine, from the characteristics of the emissions reaching his aircraft, whether the system was in search mode, sweeping broadly, or in tracking mode, focused on him. He understood the requirement and what it meant operationally. He was being asked to determine whether the radar was tracking him by flying close enough to the radar for it to track him. The circular geometry of the authorization was not lost on him. He noted it and continued north. At 6:23 a.m., his radar warning receiver changed tone. The Iranian fire control radar emission that had been present on his warning receiver since 6:21 a.m., steady, relatively low amplitude, consistent with a search sweep that was painting him as one of many returns in a broad sector scan, shifted to a narrower, higher amplitude signal that was directionally consistent with the receiver's threat-bearing indication. The pulse repetition interval compressed. The signal strength increased. The warning receiver's threat assessment algorithm updated its classification from search emissions to track while scan, the specific radar mode that preceded a firing solution. The system was tracking him. At 6:23 a.m. and 17 seconds, the flight lead transmitted to the CAOC. CAD authorization trigger confirmed. Active track on my aircraft from emitter bearing 351. Request weapons free. The CAOC response came at 6:23 a.m. and 41 seconds. 24 seconds of staffing at the most direct level available for a decision that had been pre-delegated to the theater commander for exactly this contingency. Weapons free, SEAD authorized, emitter bearing 351. The flight lead committed his AGM-88 HARM at 6:23 a.m. and 48 seconds. The HARM departed the left-wing station and immediately began homing on the Iranian radar's emission. The missile does not need to be aimed at the target in the conventional sense. Its seeker head finds the target by following the electromagnetic signal that the target is generating, which means that as long as the target continues to transmit, the missile's guidance system has a continuously updated homing signal. The HARM's effective range against the emission profile it was tracking, given the current geometry, altitude, and the signal strength the flight lead's warning receiver was measuring, was well within the published engagement parameters. Flight time from release to target was approximately 41 seconds at this range and altitude combination. The Iranian radar system had 41 seconds to cease transmitting. At 6:24 a.m. and 3 seconds, 15 seconds after the HARM release, the Iranian radar emission ceased. Complete cessation. Not a frequency shift, not a power reduction, not a waveform change. Off. The operators on the ground had detected the HARM's seeker head, its own radar emission, used to refine the terminal guidance in the final seconds of flight, and had made the decision to shut down the radar and accept the loss of the tracking solution rather than continue to provide a homing signal to the inbound missile. A HARM that loses its homing signal does not become inert. It transitions to a pre-programmed terminal guidance mode, navigating toward the last known position of the emitter, using inertial reference to maintain the trajectory, with a reduced accuracy compared to active homing, but sufficient accuracy to be operationally meaningful against a fixed or slow-moving emitter that has had its precise location established in the seeker's memory during the active homing phase. The HARM impacted at 6:24 a.m. and 29 seconds. The Rivet Joint's electronic intelligence picture showed the Iranian radar emission ceasing at 6:24 a.m. and 3 seconds and not returning afterward. The satellite surveillance system, tasked against the impact point, captured thermal imagery consistent with a high-explosive warhead detonation at the coordinates of the radar facility's antenna array. The post-impact assessment, conducted from satellite imagery over the following 40 minutes, characterized the damage as consistent with destruction of the primary antenna assembly and significant damage to the associated electronics van, the radar system's processing and power infrastructure. The mobile launcher vehicles associated with the battery had dispersed from the site in the interval between the radar shutdown and the missile impact, which was consistent with a crew that had executed a pre-planned evacuation drill for exactly this scenario. The battery had fired. The battery had been suppressed. The engagement was over in the kinetic sense. But the operational and strategic consequences were still developing, and they were developing in ways that the kinetic outcome did not fully characterize. The flight lead egressed south after the HARM employment, climbing back to his patrol altitude and conducting a systems check while the CAOC processed the engagement assessment. His wingman, who had maintained a covering position during the seed run, rejoined on his port side at 6:26 a.m. Both aircraft checked fuel states and reported to the CAOC at 6:27 a.m. Sufficient fuel for 45 minutes additional on-station time before the bingo profile required them to divert to Bahrain. At 6:29 a.m., the rivet joint transmitted an update that the CAOC had been expecting and hoping would not arrive in the form it took: a second radar emission. Different bearing. Different frequency band, different pulse characteristics. The emission was coming from a position 23 nautical miles northeast of the first battery's location. A second Iranian air defense system, presumably a different battery unit that had been positioned as a backup or a flanking element, that had been passive throughout the first engagement and was now active. Active in the specific sense. Its pulse repetition interval and its bearing relative to the F/A-18F section were consistent with a tracking mode emission rather than a search sweep. The Iranian air defense network had not been a single battery. It had been a network. The first battery had been the visible element, the one that fired, the one that drew the SEAD response, and the one that absorbed it. The second battery had been the invisible element, positioned and waiting, passive throughout the engagement while its partner absorbed the American response. It was now active, and it was tracking the two Super Hornets that had just expended their HARM ordnance on the first battery. The flight lead had one HARM. He had used it. His wingman's aircraft was not HARM configured. He was carrying a standard air-to-air loadout without an anti-radiation capability. The SEAD tool that had been available 60 seconds ago was not available now. The second battery's operators knew this or had assessed it with sufficient confidence to activate in the immediate aftermath of the first battery's suppression. The timing was not coincidental. This had been planned in sequence. Fire the first battery. Absorb the SEAD response. Activate the second battery when the SEAD-capable aircraft has expended its anti-radiation ordnance. The flight lead transmitted the second emitter data to the CAOC at 6:29 a.m. and 44 seconds and simultaneously executed a hard descending turn to the south, taking both aircraft below the altitude band where the second battery's engagement parameters were most effective. The descent burned altitude, and the altitude burned range. Every 1,000 feet lower was 1,000 feet of additional surface clutter that the Iranian radar was working against, and every additional nautical mile south reduced the signal strength of the battery's receiver. The maneuver was not evasion in the absolute sense. It was geometry management, adjusting the engagement parameters to buy time for the CAOC to process the second emitter and generate a response. The CAOC's response arrived at 6:31 a.m. Two additional FA-18Fs from the Southern Gulf Cap, HARM configured, specifically because the pre-mission intelligence update had assessed the possibility of a multi-battery engagement, were being vectored to the northern bearing. Flight time to engagement parameters: 9 minutes. The flight lead section was directed to hold south of the Strait's central channel at low altitude, maintain emissions control, and provide targeting data updates on the second emitter to the inbound section. 9 minutes. The second battery was still active and still tracking. At 6:32 a.m., the second battery's emission profile shifted. The pulse repetition interval compressed further, a change consistent with a fire control solution being refined rather than a broad tracking sweep being maintained. The rivet joint characterized the change and transmitted to the CAOC at 6:32 a.m. and 11 seconds. Second emitter now in fire control mode. Assess pre-launch. The flight lead was at 14,000 feet, 17 nautical miles south of the Strait's center line. His radar warning receiver showing the second battery's emission at an amplitude that was lower than it had been at 24,000 feet, but still definitively present. His wingman was 2 nautical miles to his southeast. Both aircraft were maneuvering, not the standard patrol maneuvering of CAP operations, but the specific, deliberate jinking that pilots apply when a surface-to-air missile fire control radar is in pre-launch mode and the engagement geometry has not yet been resolved. Jinking does not prevent a missile from being fired. It complicates the fire control solution that determines where the missile is aimed. Against a capable modern system, it is a marginal measure. It is also the only measure available when you have expended your anti-radiation ordnance and the covering section is 9 minutes away. At 6:33 a.m. and 20 seconds, the second battery's radar emission ceased, not because it had been suppressed, not because a missile had been fired and the battery was in its post-launch cool-down protocol. The emission ceased in the specific way that a radar ceases when it is shut down by an operator who has made a decision. The rivet joint noted the cessation and monitored for resumption for 4 minutes before characterizing it as a sustained shutdown rather than a temporary interruption. The reason for the shutdown was not immediately available from the electromagnetic picture alone. 2 possibilities existed in the CAOC's assessment. The battery had shut down because it had detected the inbound HARM-configured section and had made the same calculation its partner battery had made. That active transmission was more dangerous than the tactical disadvantage of going passive. Or the battery had shut down because it had received an order from the Iranian command structure to cease the engagement sequence, an order generated by whoever in that command structure had decided that the operational situation had developed far enough. The evidence that accumulated over the following 37 minutes pointed toward the second explanation. The inbound HARM section reached its engagement parameters at 6:40 a.m. with no active emitter to target. It held the northern bearing for 11 minutes on a search profile, the rivet joint feeding it every passive emission it could resolve from the Iranian coastline, looking for the second battery or any third element of the network that had not yet declared itself. Nothing appeared. The Iranian air defense network in this sector of the strait had gone fully passive and was staying passive. At 6:51 a.m., the CAOC directed all airborne assets to egress south. The immediate engagement phase was over. The accounting was conducted over the following 4 hours in the intelligence and operational assessment centers at CENTCOM and in Bahrain. The loss column was unambiguous. 1 MQ-4C Triton, unmanned maritime surveillance aircraft, valued at $220 million, destroyed in international airspace by an Iranian surface-to-air missile at 6:18 a.m. 4 hours and 51 minutes of surveillance mission lost. The persistent maritime domain awareness picture over the Strait's central channel had a gap that would take 18 hours to restore with a replacement asset repositioned from the nearest alternative staging location. The suppression column was also clear. 1 Iranian radar system destroyed by HARM employment at 6:24 a.m. 1 second battery forced to passive posture at 6:33 a.m. by the approach of a HARM-capable section. The Iranian air defense network in the Central Strait sector effectively blinded for an assessed minimum of 48 hours, while the first battery's antenna and electronics were assessed for repair or replacement, and the second battery's operators worked through whatever command calculus had produced the shutdown order. What the accounting did not resolve, what the intelligence assessment identified as the most consequential open question from the engagement, was whether the 2-battery sequence had been planned, and if planned, to what purpose. A planned sequence in which the first battery fires and draws the SEAD response while the second battery waits and then activates after the SEAD ordnance is expended was, from a tactical standpoint, a sophisticated and operationally effective concept. It was a concept that required 2 things to work: confidence in the ability of the first battery to survive, or at least function through the SEAD response long enough to deplete the American anti-radiation inventory, and confidence that the second battery could achieve a firing solution in the window between the seed expenditure and the arrival of HARM-configured reinforcements. The first battery had not survived. The second battery had not fired. But the concept had come close enough to its intended outcome to be alarming, and it had come close enough to reveal something about Iranian air defense doctrine that was new and specifically worth understanding. They were thinking about SEAD in terms of sequence management and ordnance depletion, not just electronic countermeasures. The intelligence report that carried this finding was distributed to the operational planning community the following morning. The paragraph that received the most annotation in the margins of the copies that circulated through the staff offices was not the technical characterization of the radar system. It was the tactical assessment paragraph, which read, "The engagement sequence is assessed as consistent with a deliberate Iranian doctrine to absorb a single SEAD employment in order to force SEAD-capable assets to expend their anti-radiation ordnance, then activate a reserve battery in the resulting window before SEAD-capable reinforcements arrive." The narrow margin by which this doctrine failed tonight, a 7-minute differential between the second battery's activation and the inbound section's arrival at engagement parameters, is assessed as insufficient to constitute a comfortable operational buffer under variable conditions. 7 minutes. The margin that defined the difference between a suppressed air defense network and an American aircraft that did not return from the northern strait. The Strait of Hormuz was navigable in the morning. It was navigable because 2 pilots had flown toward a radar that was tracking them, and because a missile had found an antenna array on the Iranian coast at 6:24 a.m. It was navigable because the 7-minute margin had held. It will be navigable tomorrow for the same reason, under the same terms, at the same cost to the people who go north when the mission requires it. The margin is 7 minutes. The mission requires it anyway. That is the arithmetic of this waterway, and it does not change.